Hello, and thank you for contacting Wave Support. I see from your clinical request that you're struggling a little bit with this bifocal set of contact lenses, and if I understand correctly, there's three basic questions that you're concerned about. One is the edge design regarding edge lift, and your current lens apparently are fitting rather tight. Secondly, the concern about the lens getting filmy. And third is the position of the bifocal. So let's talk a little bit about the fit, because I think that'll solve a lot of your other questions. So if we look overall, we'll start by looking at your topographies. Just a couple general observations is, Wave is a very accurate system for designing a lens, but it's only as accurate as the data that we get. So if we look at your topographies, although they look very good, as you know, we lose a little bit down here. This could be steepening of the cornea, but my guess is probably the lacrimal tear layer here somehow infringing upon that. So you lose a little peripheral data out here. You lose a little bit out in this upper corner here also. So when you're going with these larger lenses, it's very critical that we get a real accurate measurement out there. So sometimes it's hard to get that data. So if you can't quite get the data, that's okay. You just have to keep that in mind when you're designing the lens. Or secondly, another way you can kind of get that, if you're sure this is all artifact out in the periphery, especially in this inferior quadrant, when you're photo processing your design before you create the lens, you could go to the dot edit feature, and if you get out in this particular design, if you get out to the around, whoops, hang on for a second, let me clean that one up again. So if you get out here to around dots edit, and you click on it here about to the somewhere around the 24th line, you start losing some of your data after that. So sometimes what you can do, if you know this is lost data, you can just hit delete external rings. You'll get rid of that poor data, and then when you extrapolate, you'll bring that back in more uniformly. So that'll help out a little bit with the design. But if we go back to the actual lens here, actual topography in the lens. So now let's talk about the lens design itself. You mentioned from your clinical request that the lenses are centering well but fitting rather tightly out in the periphery. And you can actually see that here. So if we're looking at this design, now keep in mind we go back to the topography. We have pretty good data in this horizontal meridian. And so I would, if you had to work with this kind of topography, I would concentrate on making sure you get this lens aligned well in this horizontal meridian and not be as concerned about what the wave design looks like in that vertical meridian. With that said, if we look at your design, if you remember, this is the center of the cornea over to the left, and that green line represents the corneal surface, and the black line, of course, is your lens back surface. And so if you look here, you'll notice you have a lens a little steeper through here, and it comes down, and it lands down out here. So we refer to these as kind of downturners, because they kind of come in at an angle down here. So you got a lens that's pretty tight at the very end here and much looser in through here. And if you look around through here, it downturns at about 2 o'clock. Vertically, we get a little downturning here. So when I look at this, my first thought is this lens is going to fit pretty tight on the eye. And so, and again, we got some missed data down here in the inferior, so I don't get as concerned about that. So there's a couple ways around that. If you think the lens is actually pretty close to fitting well, and you kind of like the overall fit, and you just want to try to loosen it up a little bit, what you can do very easily is just go over here to the axial tear layer mode. So if you remember from your clinical training, axial tends to look at the central part of the cornea, but axial designs tend to fit slightly steeper in general. If you click over to tangential, tangential designs tend to fit slightly flatter overall. So if you just take your regular lens, go to tangential, hit tools, current settings, redesign it, and you did nothing more than just doing that, you'll probably flatten up that lens a little bit out in the periphery. Another thing you want to look at here, if we go back, let me see if we can get back here to axial here for a second. And I'll just kind of go back to where you were basically designed. The other thing to keep in mind with the fit on these lenses, if you remember this bottom left of the quad view, bottom left representation is the back surface of the contact lens, and the lower right of the quad view is the topography that Wave is designing off of. So quite often you can look at that lower left design and try to make that lower left topography or topographical representation look like the lower right one. And so what you can do is you can go to quadrant controls and click on 25 or 50% and just work on each meridian, adjusting them up or down to try to even that out. Or there's a great, nice little tool here, if you haven't used it yet, is you just go over here to this S factor, and basically what that is, puts a little asphericity on the back surface of the lens. And when you design using that, what you'll notice is the back surface of this lens will start to look a little bit more like the front surface of the cornea. Now you could do that in RSIM, you can do a GSIM, you can do it in freeform. If you really want the picture to look nice, the reality is your eye probably doesn't need to go freeform, but you'll notice when we do that, this back surface lens looks a lot more like here. And if you look at the lines, they line up quite nicely. Now when you look at the meridians, if you go back, click on this fluorescein pattern, you'll now look at a pretty even fluorescein pattern all the way across the lens. I know you talked about 7 microns of clearance in the end. You know, that's a nice concept if you have a perfect alignment here in the cornea, but in your original design with those downturners, that kind of throws off the numbers. And if you know, you click in the vertical versus the horizontal, you had quite a bit of difference in edge lift. So it's a nice concept. What I tend to do is just try to get this back surface as nicely aligned as I can. One thing that I have learned through the years that these axial designs tend to fit kind of snug, and if your patient is wearing a old gas perm lenses, my guess is they're wearing a spherical lens. And if you go to GSIM or freeform, now you're basically putting a toric design on a eye that's used to a spherical lens, so you're going to have a pretty much snugger fitting lens in general. So my guess is if you loosen up that lens, and I would probably keep it simple, if you like the overall look of the lens, just click on tangential like I mentioned, redesign the lens, and that'll probably flatten it out quite a bit more at the periphery for you. The other thing I've noticed through the years is that when patients have these lenses that seem to film up on them, they seem to be getting dirty. Almost inevitably, it's a patient who has borderline tear function, borderline dry eye, with a lens that's fitting too tight. So if you can loosen up that lens, you increase that tear exchange. I think you'll find that the lens doesn't get as filmy and uncomfortable for the patient. I think in your case it was after about 15 or 20 minutes. So that moves us over to the last question about the lens positioning of that bifocal. I would have chosen the positions that you chose for both the right and lens. I think those are good places to start off with. The left eye being the non-dominant eye and the right eye being the dominant eye. I would have done just like you did, slightly bigger than pupil on the right eye and slightly smaller on the left. Keep in mind these fit pretty much like if you think about a ProClear multifocal with a D design, you don't get a whole lot of reading out of these lenses. So I think if you get the fit down a little bit better, and you'll get a little bit better translation on the lens with a little flatter lens, that may allow this lens to move a little bit more when they go to read. I would incorporate the over refraction and go as much plus as you can possibly get away with, and I would go from there and see how you do. If not, if you really want to try to push the envelope on getting near vision out of this lens, you could try taking that left eye, which is the non-dominant eye, and switch it to a near center. Think of like a Air Optics multifocal type lens. And so hopefully that answers your questions. Again, what I would do if you like the overall look for the most part, I would just go and click on tangential. That'll loosen the lens of about a half diopter flatter. If you're trying to get those edge designs to match more nicely, remember to work on perfect topographies or as close to that as you can get. Sometimes I go to freeform just because it looks nice on the pictures, but the reality is that you can have a little leeway on those edge lifts in the different meridians if you, even with the RSIM or the GSIM. And then I think it'll solve a lot of your dryness or filming up issues, and that may even help this lens center better. Well, I hope you find that helpful. I wish you well with this case, and thank you for contacting Wave Support. Have a great day.